Well, to help us see more clearly on all this, we can say hello to our international affairs editor, Douglas Herbert. Hello, Doug. The world then waking up a little bit, well, Syria, but also the world waking up a bit dazed and confused about all of this. I mean, this, after a quarter of a century at the helm of a police state, Assad's rule seemed to crumble overnight. How did this come about so quickly?
Well, first of all, we all of us seem just so enlightened afterwards. Hindsight is 2020, and we now have all these easy answers and a narrative sort of taking shape as to how this happened so quickly. The reality is, almost no one would have seen this coming. Almost no one saw just how degraded and demoralized the Syrian army had become in the past years under Bashar Assad's rule. So it was, in a way, a perfect storm, perhaps, when you sort of piece it all together in retrospect and you say, so what happened here? One, I mentioned the demoralized state of the armed forces. The army, we saw as the rebels advanced, this sweeping onslaught, this offensive south, from after they captured Aleppo down to Hama, meeting little resistance on the way, literally any sort of army resistance, official government resistance, melting away, soldiers throwing off their uniforms, fleeing, sort of what we saw in Afghanistan as the Taliban was approaching Kabul a few years back. All of this had been perhaps something you could have foreseen, and there are even hints that Assad himself foresaw the fact that not everything was right in his army. He apparently had told the Iranian foreign minister in a visit last week, when all of this was just taking shape, that he was worried, privately saying he was worried about the state of affairs. So he knew, obviously Assad knew, that the army wasn't fully on board, that there were a lot of officers who sort of were no longer perhaps fully loyal to him. And then when I say a perfect storm, you had obviously the not-so-minor detail of everything else happening across that region and the Middle East. The fact that Syria's main bulwarks, its main supporters, including its biggest supporter, Russia, which basically is the one that enabled Assad to remain in power from 2015, 4 years after the civil war began. There were times back in 2015, back then, everyone thought that Assad's days were numbered. Russia came to the rescue with its planes, with its troops along the Mediterranean, got a foothold there, and propped him up ever since, along with Iran. That support melted away, as has Hezbollah. Hezbollah obviously very severely weakened in its war in the valleys with Israel. So right now, basically, all of that foundational support fell away, leaving him with nothing. And at the end of the day, there was also the rebels themselves. They saw that window of opportunity. They seized it. They advanced. They did it the right time, right place. And they got, perhaps to their own surprise, to Damascus within a matter of days.
Right, well, the rebel group that spearheaded this onslaught, HTS, has past ties to al-Qaeda, and it's been accused of human rights abuses, according to watchdog groups. Can they then be trusted to be the ones to guarantee this kind of democratic future of Syria?
Can they basically whitewash themselves? Can they make a whole new name? Can they do a little bit of what we tried to see the Taliban doing when they first got to Kabul, trying to convince the world that actually, no, we can respect women's rights? You know, they had some people believing that for a while. Look, it is way too early days, Karis, to say what this group's going to look like. But the early signs are that it's making the right noises, right? It's saying that it's going to recognize, it's going to leave the interim power right now in the hands of Bashar Assad's prime minister, who remained in Damascus, have him oversee that the initial transition, put institutions under military civilian control, but his control. So they're trying to say, we want this to be a civilian-controlled society. We want a new Syria. They're trying to shed that association you talked about. Yes, past relationship with al-Qaeda. Yes, widespread allegations of human rights abuses in their past. We don't know what this group is going to be about. We know that it has been highly extremist in the past. We know there's a reason it was put on the terrorist list by many European countries and by the United States, and remains on that terror list. Maybe they're reconsidering that now. They definitely want to show the world a new face and that they can be responsible in governing a post-Assad Syria. But they themselves are divided. They don't control all of Syria. The factions themselves could come to blows and could start squabbling. We could see, some fear, an Iraq-style scenario after the American invasion in 2003, and eventually the American pullout when we saw civil war in Iraq. That is a dark scenario. Syrians are obviously hoping for something better, wanting to trust this new rebel coalition.
Right, well, this Monday, the world is beginning to see the horrors of Assad's most notorious prisons, Sednaya in Damascus. It's known as a human butcher shop by those who've been in it. It embodies so much of the trauma that Syrian society has endured.
We've talked about Evin prison in outside of Tehran, right? And that has always been one of the most notorious, darkest prisons. You might almost say that it pales in comparison to Sednaya, based on the testimony of inmates, former inmates there, people who've come out emaciated, on the verge of absolute starvation, those who survived. Between 2011 and 2018, at least 30,000 prisoners were said to have died in that prison. There was torture, executions, not just any execution. These were executions planned meticulously, usually at secret executions in the middle of the night after summary military tribunals, which were tribunals in name only because they often lasted 1 or 2 minutes, and prisoners were hanged. And prisoners would testify, some of those living above the underground cells where the hangings took place in the dead of night, would say they'd put their ear to the floor and they would hear sort of gurgling noises of people hanging from ropes, sometimes too light for the hanging to actually kill them. So then their throats would be cut, or their necks broken after the 10 or 15 minutes hanging there on a rope. This is how bad it was. And it got even worse in Sednaya because people were disappeared. You had no idea if your relatives or the people you know, your loved ones, were actually in this prison. They simply just were not there. And there was no accountability, no one that you could actually go to, no list of inmates. And as far as feeding and everything, food was summarily thrown on the floor. Testimony says it was often thrown on the floor where there was blood of other inmates who had been tortured and beaten. It gives you a sense of just how abysmal and draconian the conditions in this prison were. The days of this prison seem to be over. Syrian Civil Defense Force, the White Helmets, are at this hour in those underground cells searching. The prisoners are being rescued. They're trying to set them all free, but it is going to be a traumatized society, and let alone for those inmates who spent all that time in that prison. The ones who survived, getting them back into society, getting them back into normal lives, that is going to be a very uphill battle.
All right. Thank you very much for that analysis, Doug Herbert.